Welcome in this beginner soldering tutorial where I want to share good soldering techniques and break down the process in a few easy steps to make it as easy as possible for your CanSat challenge. So let me introduce you to the material that you need to perform good soldering. Remember, that's an important part for your CanSat to work properly once lifted up in the sky. The first thing that you need is of course your soldering iron, which gets really hot by the way. Some solder, I recommend to use lead-free solder, your lungs will be grateful. A tip cleaner made out of wool to make your iron feel comfortable. And last but not least, some flux, also called cleaning pen, which will be your magical ace during this whole process. First things first, if you use lead-free solder, you will need a higher temperature than lead-based solder. Start with a temperature of approximately 280 degrees Celsius and check if the solder starts to melt. So let's see, we take some solder and perfect, it starts to melt, nice and shiny. So that's great. Now start by cleaning your tip a bit on the sponge, on the wool, like this, and apply some solder. This is by far the most important step. Always have some solder on your tip. We also call that wetting the soldering iron. If you don't use the soldering iron for more than a few minutes, please put it back and turn it off. Believe me, your soldering iron will really appreciate this. So first example, let's start by soldering a cable. So we need to apply some solder on our solder tip. Heat the whole copper cable up like this and feed solder from the other side. Et voila, nice and shiny, a soldered cable. Second example, soldering pins on a PCB. So I start by putting some soldering on my soldering iron, and now it's important to heat everything up. So I put my soldering iron on the pin and on the PCB, wait a second, and I feed solder from the other side. Up. Et voila, a nice and clear and shine soldering. Short recap, first step is to heat everything up, add solder from the other side, and then it's important to continue heating to get a nice shape due to capillary forces. And then you're good to go. A picture says more than 1,000 words. A good soldering point is not only important because of an aesthetical point of view. You need to know that the solder offers electrical conductivity as well as mechanical stability. So yes, it could be that your cold joint looks okay. Now imagine your CanSat getting rocketed up in the sky with a lot of vibrances. So that's a case where a cold joint could lead to failure. So as you could see, everything went fine. However, it's not always that easy. There are a lot of problems, and that's why I want to show you some techniques. You will notice that some pins are not that easy to solder than others, and that's totally normal. Mostly those pins are called GND, also called ground. Basically, under the black surface that we call a solder mask, you will find a lot of different copper traces and large copper planes. And those ground pins are mostly connected to big copper planes or big copper areas. And then the following is happening. So if you put a soldering iron to such a pin, which is connected to a big surface, then all the heat is getting dissipated real quick to your PCB. So this means that the PCB maybe gets some energy from your soldering iron. However, the point where you want to get put on your solder is not getting warm enough. And that's why you find yourself having difficulties to solder those ground pins. And that's why I will name you a few tricks in the next video. So the first trick is to higher up the temperature of your soldering station, but take in mind that you can't apply a too high temperature for too long, because otherwise you will damage your PCB and the components. Another trick is to use a larger soldering tip. So that's what I did. You put some solder on it, warm everything up, wait a second, and feed solder from the other side. Like this. Gently, et voila, your pin is soldered. So that's all because of heat transfer. Another problem could be just your soldering tip. So remember, it needs to be nice and shiny so that your solder starts to melt properly. However, it could be at some point that your soldering tip is not that shiny anymore, so it gets a bit darker. And that's where you start to notice that your solder is not melting that good anymore. And basically for that particular tip, I will advise you to give it a bit more cleaning. So apply some solder on your tip, brush it to the wool, a few seconds, half a minute, apply again some new solder and brush it again until it starts to get more shiny, and then you're good to go. If that's not helping, then just take a new soldering tip. So now I want to show you the real magic of using flux. So we want to solder a header on a PCB. So use some flux, use it gently, put it everywhere where you need to solder up like this. That's good. You can use as much as you want. Use more than less. And then again put enough solder on your tip, so you got a good heat transfer, like this, and heat everything up, and then you just pass by back, like this. Et voila, you got nice soldering points, quite fast, and that only because of the flux. So now we see a little problem. We see a short circuit between those two pins, but luckily you can remove it. Start by applying some flux on your solder to remove any old oxidation, like this. Take your soldering iron, remember to put some solder in it, and yes, even for the soldering you still need a good heat transfer, so you need some solder on your solder tip. Gently warm everything up until it starts to melt. Take your soldering pump and remove any excessive soldering. Problem solved. And last but not least, it's important to clean your PCB when you are finished. Take some high percentage alcohol like isopropanol and put your PCB in a bath. Gently brush the flux and soldering residues away. If done, dry everything and your PCB will be happy. That's important in order to reduce the risk of corrosion. Okay, so let's do a short recap of today's soldering lessons. First one, always have some solder on your iron in order to hold it in a good state. As you need a good heat transfer for soldering, always put some solder on your tip. Don't be afraid if it's not working, just take a look at the following list. Clean your tip. Needs to be nice and shiny. If you find yourself having difficulty soldering a pin than others, use a larger soldering tip or a higher temperature for a short time. And last but not least, my favorite advice, always apply some flux on the parts to be soldered. Alright, enjoy and have a good time soldering your CanSat.